Rod, let me take you back to when you were a young journalist and you joined the BBC when you were in your 20s, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
What impression did you have of the BBC in those days? And did you feel proud joining that organisation? What were your expectations of the BBC?
I felt very proud joining the BBC and excited to do so, especially on a programme such as a Day programme, where I'd been working, which was in the Labour Party, was regarded with awe. And I arrived there and it was very friendly. I was one of 3 people at that point out of 46 who went to a state school. And there were 5 people there when I joined who were at Eton. And I just thought, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, if I turned up to this job and there were 5 people who'd gone to my comp in Middlesbrough, so that it would be a coincidence. But they were very nice people, haphazard, dishevelled, very old school, and a very agreeable place to work for a time.
Of course, you were coming from the left, so they knew you had come from the Labour Party. Did it feel as if you were amongst friends in that sense? Did it feel politically very agreeable to you?
No, they were several yards to the left of where I was, most of them. I mean, in a kind of not when it came to financial issues, but in almost every social issue, they were exactly as they are today, very agreeably bien-pensant and liberal on pretty much everything. There were a couple of exceptions. There was a rather gruff and a pleasing man called Francis Hailwood, who was to the right of a soup spoon. But other than that, there was a unanimity of opinion.
Did it surprise you at all going into the BBC? Was it what you expected
I tell you why it surprised me. And it was an interesting time. This was the late 80s. And I think that the cultures change in countries over time. And I think that we were in the process then of the culture changing completely, both within the BBC, within the judiciary, within the Church of England, within all of our institutions. That's when the change was really taking place. Because if you go back to the 70s, the BBC would have been considered a conservative institution. And certainly all the popular performers at the time, all the people everybody liked, from Jimmy Tarbuck and the 2 Ronnies and Morecambe and Wise and Lulu, were all conservatives. And the tilt of the agenda tended to be conservative. It was criticised for such. I remember being outraged by the BBC and its attitude to punk rock. I was a punk rocker at the age of 15, 16. And it completely changed over the course of beginning in the early 80s. It became, I think Margaret Thatcher kind of helped the change along. They couldn't abide her.
No.
They didn't get her. They didn't get, any more than they get today, why people are patriotic, why they like normal, ordinary family life and faith and all that kind of stuff. They didn't get Thatcher's appeal to the mass majority of the population. They just didn't get it.
I well remember that, and there was a real animus against Thatcher, wasn't there? And, I mean, I think that showed in the journalism. I don't know if you'd agree.
Well, without question. I mean, when it came to the argument as to whose side are you on, Margaret Thatcher or the IRA, there was no debate within the BBC. We think we have the right to put Sinn Féin on air whenever we like, and you're censoring us. Her arguments simply didn't hold water. They were querulous as well. And I guess this is also where it began, because it did begin in those early 80s, the Falkland War, where the BBC started getting very sceptical about the Falkland War. And the BBC should be a bit sceptical. I mean, don't doubt that. But by the time we got into the 90s, the BBC was moving further and further away from the values, aspirations and tastes of the people who pay for its existence.
Do you put any credibility behind the idea of the so-called long march through the institutions.
Yeah.
Do you believe that is what has happened?
Yes, it's exactly what has happened. Good old Gramsci, he was right. It wasn't actually Gramsci, it was someone quoting Gramsci, I think, but I forget who.
It was Rudi Deutsch.
It was Rudi Deutsch, wasn't it? That's right, yes, yeah. Yes, it's remarkable, and it's happened not quite how it was envisaged, in that what has happened is that a very small coterie of people has, over the course of 30 years, continually invited into its environs people who think exactly the same as itself, and that there are some opinions which are simply contraband and you would not be allowed to express them, and therefore you don't get the job. So it's been done in a kind of authoritarian way. A lot of these jobs, of course, are not the sort of jobs which are open for interview. You are appointed. If you look at all of our quangos and major institutions, you will find the same names cropping up over and over again, to the point where you can play I would advise you, if you're bored at Christmas, to play this game, which is 6 Degrees of Shami Chakrabarti. That whatever position in whatever quango or charity you find, you could get to Shami Chakrabarti in about 2 or 3 moves, you know? And Shami herself was on about 4 boards, and National Film Board or something, you know. What does she know about films? Why? Why is Lord Hall boss of the National Opera and boss of the National Gallery? And how does this happen? I'd like to do that.
I mean, so I met you actually on the Today programme back in the 80s, the first time. We went to a gay wedding together.
We did, yes.
We went to a gay wedding together. And I wondered, I mean, to me at that time, you seemed to be pretty much identikit lefty. To me, you seemed, because I was always someone who thought of myself as a conservative with a small c.
Yeah.
And so I saw you then as somebody who was just one of them. But over time in the BBC...
Did you not see me laughing my head off at the gay wedding?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I remember the thing. I remember I have an absolutely distinct memory of the floral arch and the...
Yes.
I mean, it was so camp, you know. It was Baden-Powell on stilts. The whole thing. It was brilliant. However, that's by the by. So you seemed to me to fit in at that point. But you were, I mean, horrible expression, but you were on a journey, weren't you? Yourself, a sort of political journey.
Yeah.
I mean, how did that... Tell me about it.
It's difficult. In truth, even when I was a trot, you know, back when I was 15, 16, I've always been left-wing on green issues and financial issues. But I've always had grave doubts on social issues, even back when I was young. But because I was part of the Labour Party, you know, and then part of the BBC, these didn't seem to be things which you could advance opinions about. I can remember advancing opinions about the legitimacy of abortion. And the horror, that absolute horror that was occasioned. But it may be that the BBC itself hastened me on that journey, because it just seems so grotesquely unfair, so grotesquely biased. And it's not, as people sometimes say, a left-wing bias. It just isn't. You couldn't argue, for example, that the BBC gave Jeremy Corbyn an easy time. And indeed, on financial issues, I suppose it's largely because they're affluent middle-class people. They don't seem to be screaming for tax rises all the time, you know. Just on those social issues, but I say just because, au contraire, Karl Marx, this is not false consciousness. These things matter to people. Faith matters to people. Patriotism matters to people. They had no time whatsoever for that, and it made me angry. And the first signs of anger, I think, what would have been the first? I think Clause 28. There was no debate about Clause 28. I think Clause 28 was right. You know? Now even the people who signed up to Clause 28, such as Michael Portillo, saying how ghastly of me, forgive me. I think it was probably right.
Because
I don't think we need our children taught about the myriad sexual adventures which they will undoubtedly experience after the age of 16. Leave them alone.
so it's not a moralistic position, but you're saying that
It's a partly moralistic position, because I also think at the same time that the best way to raise a family, to bring children into the world, is with the biologically, genetically determined parents, a man and a woman. This isn't the church speaking. This is what science tells us. That every single study that's ever been done tells us that this is the best way. And it seems to me wrong, therefore, to start inculcating into kids at a very early age that, no, you can do something different to that. Go on, you know you want to. Which, of course, we've had in even greater fecundity over the last 15 to 20 years with the advent of those excellent transgender people.
And within the BBC, it has always seemed to me that there is an automatic approval of and putting the weight behind any campaign which is transgressive on these social issues.
This is what infuriated me, and it still does. There will be an article, there will be a piece on the news about anti-abortion protests in America. And it will come solely from one perspective. It will not even debate the issue as to whether they're right or not. You won't even hear the issue. It's simply, these people are victimizing women and they've got to be stopped. Could this happen here? We go to Jennifer Harridan from the organization, Women Are Cross About Everything. And Jennifer comes on and she says, this could happen here. And it's just relentless. And they never see the other side. You just don't get the other side at all.
And yet all this is within the context of the BBC's much trumpeted ethos of impartiality. I mean, how can an organisation which says...
Because it doesn't believe it's political, Robin. It doesn't believe it's political. It simply thinks it's civilised. And that civility extends to, obviously, the Europe issue, where it simply thinks that we're Little England as xenophobes, rather than can make a decent case for why we might be better off outside the European Union. And it's also a kind of vacant, banal identification with the underdog in every single case. And so that's what you get in foreign coverage. Without question, the BBC was opposed to Robert Mugabe. It was not remotely fair to Robert Mugabe. Good thing, you might argue. But by the same context, it's not remotely fair to Israel. Not by any stretch of the imagination.
And yet, BBC journalists live and die by the idea of impartiality. How is it they don't see? I mean...
Well, this is what Richard Tate... do you remember the Tate report?
I do.
And he didn't address the issue of bias enough, but he did say that people have got to know, they've got to try to recognise their bias. But they don't see it as a bias. They see it as decency. It is this liberal worldview. It's incredibly arrogant. That it is decent and everybody else, anyone who disagrees with it, is indecent, beyond the pale. They do not see it as political. And it's unanimous. I went to a really enjoyable party for an old colleague at the BBC, and there were 100 people there. I was the only one who had voted for Brexit. The only one. And it's the same on every issue. And they don't see it as political at all.
The Brexit issue, of course, is a particularly interesting one because Brexit, as we both know, I mean, any working journalist in Britain over the past 30 years knows that actually that is the fault line which has run down right through the centre of British politics. So it was an issue where an organisation which is the biggest journalistic organisation in the country and the most important cultural organisation in the country should have been striving to do its level best to make sure that on that issue both sides of the argument were properly represented, but they weren't. How does that happen?
Well, two things. I think leading up to 2016, in the short period leading up to 2016, they did their job. I don't think they were bad. I think there was sufficient pressure coming on them to let them know that they had to be seen to be neutral. However, in the years from 1992 to 2014, the opposite is the case. There was continued systematic bias against people who would call themselves Euro-realists. And at the time, the opinion polls were pretty clear. Most people, until about 2010, wanted to stay in the EU, but they didn't want the EU to get any bigger. And there was a good, 30% who wanted to leave. The BBC never reflected those views. It never reflected the views of the people who didn't want the EU to get bigger either. And it continually discriminated against people. And there were studies, Lord Pearson of Ranach did one such study and brought it to me and told me about it, the amount of airtime given to Eurosceptic voices, and I agreed with him. And I took it to Anne Sloman, and she said, "You've got to understand, Rod, that these people are mad." That was the view. And everyone thought it. There was a very funny time, I must tell you this, on a different issue. There was an American election coming up. What would it be? 2000? 2000, I think. And Mark Danazer, who was then head of news, I think, invited us all into his office, all the editors of the programmes, to give us a good, stern lecture about how we should avoid bias to either side in this forthcoming US election. And behind him on the wall, as we were sitting looking at him, were posters for the Democratic Party and campaigns which he had worked for the Democratic Party in. And I just sat, this is beyond surreal,
Yeah.
And on Europe, there was another report, I forget what the name of the report was, came out in 2000, you've written about it.
Yeah, that's right.
Which said, they were biased. They keep being told they're biased, and they keep saying, we're not. No, not really.
Of course,
it's just pathetic.
The bias against the Republicans reached a new peak under Trump, didn't it? I mean, what did you think of the way the BBC reported Trump?
Just the whole thing made me actually vomit. It wasn't just Trump. Had I been in America in 2008, was it 8? I think it was 8. I would probably have voted for Barack Obama. But the way they greeted his victory, the ejaculate flying round the studios, people dancing with joy. It's just absurd.
Yeah.
They weren't alone. Obama got the Nobel Prize within about 6 weeks. We're going to give him the Nobel Prize because he's black. There's no other reason. He hadn't done anything.
No.
And then you compare it to Trump, where they were openly hostile all the way through his presidency. And by God, their delight when Joe Biden won. You could see it. Yes.
Were you struck also by the way that certain stories in the culmination of that campaign were sat on, like the story about
the Hunter Biden story?
Yeah, the Hunter
Biden story was, in fairness, the Hunter Biden story was sat on by the entire liberal establishment. And far less worrying than the BBC sitting on it, because I don't know how much traction it would have got over here. Some. But, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all sitting on it and banning anyone from commenting on it.
That's it. That raises an interesting point. To what extent do you see the BBC as, it were, part of a a big media liberal cartel. I mean, do you think that the BBC shows any independence of mind or thought when it comes to this sort of issue, like the BLM issue or like the Trump issue? Has the BBC acquitted itself any better than any of the rest of them?
No, the BBC is exactly the same as the rest of them. Liberal arts grads, by and large, who share a single worldview, which they don't think is political, but which is au courant within CNN. The New York, the worst newspaper in the world, the New York Times, an appalling newspaper, and also the big tech social media companies. They are all of the same opinion, and it's getting dangerous because they are censoring stuff, and this is bad. They shouldn't be doing that. Some of the censoring which has been done by the big tech companies is truly chilling. And I think we saw with the defeat of Trump, who I would never have voted for, with the defeat of Donald Trump, that this is the first time an election has actually been gerrymandered and won by a liberal elite in charge of communications organisations.
It was interesting, wasn't it? The alacrity with which the BBC, after the election was held, dismissed any idea that there had been voting irregularities.
Yeah. I think there probably weren't voting irregularities, or not many.
No.
But no, they had no interest whatsoever in doing that story. None at all.
And BLM?
It's pretty shocking. We've got to get to grips with it, because this isn't on the BBC. It's more on the other institutions supported by the BBC, because this could happen here. On BLM, the BBC was entirely uncritical of BLM. And I think the BBC's stance on BLM helped to persuade organisations led by fabulously stupid people, such as the Football Association, that they should be totally uncritical of BLM. And so they all went along with it. And so we have, every single time a football game is played and players take a knee, the crowd boos. Every single time. They do not get it. These people do not get how repellent we find BLM.
Tell me, how widespread do you think disaffection is with the BBC now? I mean, we're talking as people who have both worked for the organisation and been long-standing critics of it publicly. So, we are like-minded to a certain extent about that. But do you think that this sense of distrust of the BBC has filtered down into the minds of, the average person? Do you think it is doing?
It is doing. It's a long process. But you're beginning to see it more and more. And the obvious way you're beginning to see it is the growth of independent commercial stations which do not take the view of the BBC. So, GBTV, for example, is going to be popular. There's also Talk Radio, which is the fastest growing radio station in Europe, and shooting up like that. I don't think you'd get that if there was a general satisfaction with the way the BBC presented itself.
And some people are refusing to pay their licence fees.
And some people are refusing to pay their licence fee, yeah.
How serious a threat to the BBC do you think all that is?
It's difficult. It changes by the month. I think if you went back 14 months to February 2020, I think there was a genuine assault on the BBC, partly from within the public not wanting to pay its licence fee. You just had the debacle of last night of the proms. And you had an incoming government which was explicitly hostile to the BBC, with Dominic Cummings and people like that. And the resignation of Tony Hall, and the resignation of Sarah Sands, the editor of the Today programme, you could see a kind of end in sight. COVID comes along, and I think the BBC, for the first 4 months of COVID, didn't do a bad job. I think people suddenly remembered, sometimes it can bring the country together. And I think it did do that a little bit. BLM comes along, however, and shatters that myth that perhaps it's got the interests of the people at heart. So I think we're probably now, after the Panorama imbroglio and Martin Bashir, who I never thought was much cop, if I'm honest, but there we are. I think we're pretty much back at where we were in February 2020.
I mean, you mentioned the COVID coverage, and like you, I thought that at the start of that, in fact, the BBC rediscovered what public service broadcasting is all about.
Yeah, that's right.
That's not a phrase you hear so often these days. But there is. I don't know if you'd agree with me, but do you think that the ideal of public service broadcasting, the ideal of having an impartial news gathering journalistic organisation, is a worthwhile one and a good one?
Yes, I'm a social democrat. Of course I do. I think it's a great thing to have. But its problem is that it's hamstrung by this notion that it has to be neutral. And under the cloak of that neutrality, it is not neutral. And so what you need to do is to encourage BBC staff to tell us what their political opinions are. And then we can see how well balanced it is. And what way do they vote? Because what you need is 1,000 flowers blooming. What you need is what I tried to do on the Today programme by hiring a reactionary old tosser like you, Robin, if I may say so, and indeed Patrick Mercer, and indeed Michael Gove at one point.
Yes.
There has to be a multiplicity of opinion.
Yes. And that was such a refreshing thing for me, actually, when I joined your team on Today, because it was the first time, I think, that I'd worked on a programme at the BBC where there was an openness to journalistic inquiry, which wasn't running on the liberal tram lines.
No, that's right.
That was the point of it, really.
Absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. And if you're a journalist, you have to be interested in all that. You have to try to see the other side. And try to see the very left-wing side of issues as well,
Indeed. I've never been able to do that, actually. I mean, you handled in your time as an editor a lot of very good BBC reporters. This question of impartiality, I wonder if it comes down to this. I mean, how can you expect people who are national journalists at a national level, people who have know the trade inside out and have done their time? Most of them have strong opinions, don't they, about things? They have strong personal opinions.
Yes, and they know their stuff.
Is it realistic to expect people to be impartial?
No, it's a delusion. It's an utter delusion, and it's always been a delusion. The Tony Hall quote, I think, was that we expect that when people come into the BBC, they will hang their opinions up on a coat rack. I don't think there's a coat rack big enough for Emily Maitlis. Where's she going to store all her stuff? She'd have to hire somewhere. No, of course, it's a delusion. It's a delusion, but it's a comfortable delusion because it enables them to say, no, we leave our opinions at the door. But you don't. You don't in story selection, in the way it's reported, in the tone of delivery. Not remotely.
And in the diversity of opinion amongst the staff.
And in the diversity of... that's the crucial thing. There needs to be diversity of opinion among the staff. That means, to a certain degree, also a diversity of class background amongst the staff, which there most certainly is not. But also, just people with different views. I know one lad who works for one of the BBC's top journalistic programmes who is in perpetual fear because he's right of centre. I'm
sure you, like me, have had this experience, though. I've written stuff, often very critical of the BBC, and then I'll get an email from someone, who's senior at the BBC, still an on-air personality, knows their stuff, saying, right on, you got that right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people, aren't there, in the BBC itself, at quite senior positions, who actually would not reject what you're saying as nonsense, but would actually privately agree with you.
I think they would. There will always be resistance, though, to the stating of political views. I wouldn't have a problem if Emily Maitlis, for example, who's the obvious example of someone who's clearly politically on the liberal left, despite the public school education of her children, obviously. I wouldn't mind if she promulgated those views regularly. I wouldn't care, because it would mean that Newsnight would then have to get in someone to present the programme who put a different perspective in order to provide that balance.
So look at the future now. We're just in the aftermath of the Martin Bashir scandal, and the dust is still settling to a certain extent on that. Do you think there is going to be change at the BBC, and if so, how do you think it can be enforced?
I think I'm more optimistic than most people on this. I think there's a good new Director General in charge who I think gets it. I think he gets it. And all that prevaricating over last night at the proms, sorted like that, all that lying that Tony Hall did, which was lying. It was lying.
Yes.
And blaming the poor conductress. So he gets it. I think in tandem with that, there are two other things. First is the growth of independent channels, which will put a different point of view, which makes it clearer to the public that the BBC's is one view. And thirdly, we've got a government which has had enough. Now, it's not turned its guns on the BBC just yet, but you're seeing with Liz Truss and the defenestration, thank the Lord, of Stonewall, and in the judicial decision about the Tavistock Clinic, you're seeing a bit of a change. You're seeing a change in tone. And so I think those things together may impress upon the BBC the need to face reality, and which is to ensure that it represents the values of all of its audience rather than just those who live in Kensal Green.
It's a matter of self-preservation to a certain extent, isn't it?
Absolutely it is. Yeah, because otherwise we won't have a licence fee. Yeah.
Where would you stand on the? So, if I was to ask you, then, BBC, keep it and reform it, or scrap it altogether, what do you think?
I'd prefer to see it reformed. Whether it can be reformed is another issue. I think the next 2 years are crucial. If Tim Davie can effect real change, then I think it might be worth having a BBC, which is a public service broadcaster. But it's a tall order, and I don't fancy his job one bit.
Yes, the idea of reform at the BBC, if that is to be made a reality, it's going to need a change of personnel, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you see, I think they should have made Andrew Neil, Paul Dacre, or Trevor Phillips chairman. And I think what they've got to do is look at the board. The board of the BBC is one of the first places you should go to if you ever want to play 6 Degrees of Shami Chakrabarti. They are all, there are people on there, I have no idea what their interest in broadcasting is, but they all have the same view. Get rid. You need a board which will react with fury when they see biased coverage, not one which merely sort of is emollient.
One thing that stands in the way of reform, I think, is that politicians, by and large, are frightened of the BBC.
Less so than they were.
You think?
Yeah, far less so than they were. And I think the BBC understands that as well. And I think it understands its vulnerability now more than it did. But increasingly, this government looks as if it is prepared to take on stuff which will find a voice with kind of what you might call populism.
One of the things that disarms the critics of the BBC to a certain extent is that I think most of us, probably 90% of the population, will have at least one warm memory of the BBC, yes? So the point is that we've all enjoyed programmes that the BBC have produced, and we can all look at things and say, this is a programme which probably no one else would have produced or produced as well as the BBC has done. So the thing is that there is a core of value there, isn't there, for the country?
There's a real value there. I can remember listening to I think it was the last presidential election in the United States, and they sent Jim Naughtie to do a piece in, I think, in the Rust Belt, and it was superb journalism. You know, and it's what Jim does best of all, on the hoof journalism. And I thought, I don't think anyone else would either have the money, because of course money is the big issue, or maybe the inclination to do journalism with that level of intelligence and reportage. You see, I think the BBC is, for those reasons, valuable. But I find myself in a dwindling minority amongst friends. You know, even people who 2 or 3 years ago would have said to me, well, we need to keep the BBC, and now say, no, scrap it, get rid of it, get rid of the licence fee.
A final question.
Yeah.
I mean, you have been a very virulent at times public critic of the BBC. Has the BBC ever engaged with you in these terms about reform and what needs to be done? I only ask because I'm in the sort of similar position, although less prominent than you, but they've never actually engaged with me, and I see myself as a reasonable critic of the BBC, not someone who wishes to destroy the organisation, but wishes it to reform. But I think there's a reluctance in the BBC to actually engage with critics.
Robin, they think we're mad. They do. They think we're mad. They think we're wrong and we're mad. And they are in that bubble where everyone thinks the same as them. And then they will go onto their Twitter feeds where they are followed by people who think the same as them. And they think this is the country. And it's not the country. It's Kensal Green. You know, it really is. They think we're mad and wrong and that they have the public with them. And they don't.
Rod Liddle, thank you.